And I'm also going to paste the link in the chat there. And I just want you to take a minute to think about what is your most challenging thing when you think about culturally responsive teaching or culturally responsive design. So if you're trying to design an online course or even a face-to-face course, what does that look like? What are those challenges? And if you click on that link or use the QR code with your phone, you'll see some of the other answers that I've collected from the last couple of things, just to kind of give you an idea of where other people are. Again, these are anonymous unless you leave your name. Sometimes people do like to leave their name. So I wanted to start off with that. So if you could let me know kind of what you think the most challenging things are about culturally responsive teaching. That's kind of gonna launch what we're talking about today. And really, when you think about it, there's so many challenges with it. But I'd like to hear directly from you at your institutions and in the roles where you are. What are some of those challenges? So if you could just take a minute and complete that, it would be appreciated.
Courtney, I'm sorry, I haven't used Padlet before. I don't know how to type in my response.
Oh, I'm sorry. So when you get there, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a plus, and you just click on the plus, and it will come up with in the bottom right, there should be a pink mark, a pink plus.
I don't have that.
Okay. Are you using your phone or are you using?
Nope.
You're
Computer.
using the link. All right,
Yes.
let's see.
Do they have to be logged in?
No.
Okay.
No, it should be that you're able to go right to.
There's not to sign in or log in.
No, it's a public Padlet and everybody uses it. So you
What about clicking on no share wouldn't do it?
No, I've never had this issue before, so you should just be able to.
I'm sure it's just me.
No, it's not just you, because I saw some other people shaking their head.
I don't have the plus either. I signed in as well, just to be sure.
Okay, that's so odd.
So when we go to the Padlet.com, then up comes several different, I guess, topics. Like
yeah, those are people.
Maintain a safe space. So just pick one.
Yeah, you should be able to. It doesn't matter. I mean, we can come back to this because I don't want to waste your time with this, and I can fix it while you're doing the next activity.
There's hearts that you can click on, I guess, to say that
you can click on a heart. I'm just confused. Like there's comments, like I just added comments, but you should be able to add your own. I've done this the same way every time, so I'm not sure why it's not working. But we'll figure it out. I'll figure that out later. All right. Well, moving on. You can fill that out when we're in the groups. I've never had that happen before, so I am terribly confused. All right. Well, today what we're talking about is culture, community, and connection in online spaces. And I'm happy to be with you again. My name is Dr. Courtney Plotz, and I really, really look forward to speaking with you today. So this is kind of our agenda. We're going to do some polling. Everything else should work because I used everything else before I started, which I always do. We're going to talk about the challenges. We're going to talk about, especially in online spaces, why maybe some of the practices that you've heard about or become familiar with don't necessarily work the way that they should. And then we're going to talk about what's called a prescriptive model of cultural responsiveness and why we need it. And as a psychologist, you know, the type of psychology that I look at is looking at learning environments and why students aren't learning, and what barriers are there to help them learn. So the pre-question that I asked you was kind of what are some of those challenges? So I will give you the opportunity now if you don't want to talk in the Padlet. Does anyone just want to share a challenge that they think is related to cultural responsiveness or some of the challenges that you've had in the past? Is there anybody who kind of wants to share something? All right. Well, most of the time, the question becomes is why is this thing called cultural responsiveness frustrating or challenging? And there's a whole bunch of reasons why. Number one, instructors in particular usually like guarantees about things, right? There's two groups of people who like guarantees, and it's usually faculty and instructors. So, or I'm sorry, faculty and students. So students usually say something like, if I do this, will I get X grade, right? Whether it's the bare minimum or everything. When it's a faculty member, it sounds something more like, you know, if I do this, you know, will I receive tenure? Or if I do this, will I get the stipend or something like that? And that's not all faculty, but it's definitely a lot of people. And faculty by nature don't like to go into situations where they feel like they're unsure, right? So the question is why does this thing called cultural responsiveness get so kind of convoluted and frustrating in so many ways? And the first reason is because nobody wants to get it wrong, right? Nobody goes into teaching to get things wrong. And that's a challenge, especially as an instructor. We're supposed to be the people in the classroom who have the answers. We're the leadership in the classroom. So when it comes to things like cultural responsiveness, we do not want to get it wrong. The second thing is people need to see value in cultural responsiveness. So the way that we've set it up to this point, it's put people in really kind of all or nothing spaces. And it's confused a lot of people. So if you might be at an institution where you see the value in cultural responsiveness, but other people don't, or maybe you feel like it's you and one other person and the rest of the institution is like, eh. There's also this thing called CR Islands, which builds off that same concept, which is for people who really understand this work, they have to go outside of their institution to get that level of support because they're basically an island in their own institution. The other problem is students aren't involved in the process. So we do all this stuff about cultural responsiveness. And again, just the way we've talked about it, it means everything and nothing, right? So for the people who get it, they're like, oh, I totally get it. But for the people who are struggling to get it, it's like, what are you even talking about? Like, I don't understand. I don't understand cultural responsiveness. I don't understand anything you're talking about. Like, why do I have to try to individually like meet each student's needs culturally? Like, I don't get it. And I think we have to be honest about that we've created that system to put people in those places because we've polarized what good teaching is in some instances and what good course design is as well. The other problem with cultural responsiveness is people are super complex, right? People have had a variety of experiences. So for instance, if you take a concept that can be very polarizing, right? Something like critical race theory, which really doesn't have anything to do with cultural responsiveness. I'm just giving an example. That is super, super polarizing, right? And the problem is anytime you have something polarizing, it makes people kind of double down on whatever their original beliefs are. And that's partly due to that complexity of the human experience, right? I can meet someone who looks like me and sounds like me and grew up in my same neighborhood, but that doesn't mean that we view things the same or think the same or have the same experiences. And so the problem is what that's created is this kind of resistance to anything that's culturally responsive. And so the pushback is kind of rooted in this concept of this global view of culturally responsive teaching. And the pushback that I hear or I get a lot of times, which is totally valid, which is I have 250 students. How the heck am I supposed to meet the cultural need of every single student? That is an extremely overwhelming prospect, right? But the more effective view is to say, if I look at how I'm teaching and designing things, and you can insert any ethnicity. In our country, it happens to be European. But if I look at the best practices and who's talking and what's happening, it's mostly in a Eurocentric lens, right? So and you can replace that with anything, whether it's a Eurocentric lens, an Asian lens, an Afro-American lens, an Afro-Dominican lens, whatever lens that you want to put on that, the wiser thing to do would be to say, I recognize that this is one kind of cohesive voice, and that there has to be other ways to do things that would be more beneficial to other people for different reasons, right? So it's not saying how can I meet each individual need of a student, it's more so how can I create a learning environment where more people have access to the material as an effective learning experience. And so particularly when you're talking about online spaces, this is super important, because in online spaces, the face-to-face natural kind of interactions require facilitation. So for instance, a lot of people, what they do, if you're in your face-to-face course and you're in your room, sometimes your students stand outside your room and they're talking, right? They're just talking, kind of doing their thing. But in an online space, that doesn't really happen that way, right? So that's a problem. So one of the easy fixes for that is just saying, listen, I'm going to let you all in, create a breakout room and go in the breakout room and have those student conversations while I'm getting ready, right? Because that has to be facilitated. Additionally, when you look at kind of online and the development of online teaching, it's very transactional. So it's, you will complete a task and I will do a behavior that responds to that task. And there's little, in the literature as a whole, there's very little wiggle room for the actual pieces of culture and those differences. Online teaching is also based in convergent thinking, which is known as critical thinking, but a lot of cultures value divergent thinking first. And so we're missing an opportunity to engage students, right, in that way. And so it kind of creates this all or nothing view of what cultural responsiveness is, right? And so you ask yourself, well, what is this thing called cultural responsiveness? The reason that you do cultural responsiveness is because it takes down the marginalization of a learner. And so the first time that I saw this happening, it actually was not with ethnic groups, it was with military students. So I had students who were coming back from the military, they were either veterans or active duty, and I noticed that they had a really hard time. They were fine doing the task completion, but they were having a really hard time engaging in the learning culture. So for the military students who had PTSD, they would sit in the back of the classroom with their sunglasses on. Right? For the military students who were trying to re-engage with their family because they just came back from deployment and try to manage school, they never could fully kind of get into the learning process the way their peers could. They knew it, I knew it, their peers knew it. And so the question was what shifted in the learning environment? Because when they're in the military, they can sit, they can listen, they can take tests, and they're fine. But sometimes in the switching to that academic environment, it was very difficult for them. And so the reason that you want to consider culturally responsive teaching is because it's not always about ethnicity and race. It's about the shift in culture that occurs when our students are moving from one environment to another. And so this research is old. This research is almost 40 years old. We know that particularly when someone is experiencing a culturative stress, that they can feel marginalized, they can feel racialized, they can feel underrepresented, right? And that's one of those challenges with military students, is that they're used to being in their pod with their people, and we've removed that whole culture, and then we tell them to come and sit down and learn in this academic environment. That's a culturative stress. And so when we see that, we have to ask ourselves, are we teaching to increase that barrier, or are we teaching to decrease that barrier? And do we have the skills as facilitators, as instructional designers to kind of make that happen? And so the question is, what's a culturative stress? And all it means is that there's stress that occurs, and that stress occurs because of a change in the cultural environment. Now, when you look at the research, a lot of it has to do with international students, but there's more work being done on a more global front of, I'm moving from one job to another. I was a remote worker, now not a remote worker, that type of stuff. So that's all it means. It just means that there's a reduction in general overall well-being because the stress of the cultural difference is too high. So, and this is really important to understand. In my work, I do not work with systemic issues. So I don't look at societal context. And this is really important to understand, especially for learning and cognition. What you've probably heard and what you're familiar with is social marginalization, which means that there's some sort of system that's oppressing some other group of people, and the system is there has to be some sort of social justice to rectify that system. That is a verb. That is social marginalization. Psychological marginalization, and what I look at, is there is some sort of a culture, there's some sort of a culture of stress in the environment, right? Whether that's a Black student attending a predominantly white institution, whether that is a student who's recently retired from the military and now they're in academia. And in this instance, marginalization is someone's response to that level of stress. It is not the response to change the whole system as a whole. I'm looking at individual experiences, and particularly those experiences that reflect teaching and learning, right? So that's a big difference. That's a big difference there. So I just want to make that really clear, because this is a whole different thing. This is saying, I am shifting a system, we are changing policy, we are changing all of these things. We need social justice. And I'm not saying that we do or don't need those things. What I'm saying is, in my realm, I look at what can be measured. And for me, a lot of the social justice work, it's terribly important, but it's missing things that for me as a psychologist can show the actual problem. And there are lots of larger studies and empirical studies that support that. But again, that's just for me in my scope of what I do for a living. And so what I want to do is show you an example of this, not using students. I want to show you an example of this, and I hate to take you back there, but I'm going to take you back to 2020. Because it's the best example that I can give you with this information. So, and I love this guy's face because I feel like it really encompasses kind of how we all felt when we heard we weren't working in person anymore, because he's kind of like, what? Like, right? So this is an example of everything that I just shared. So in 2020, you were minding your own business, you were at your institution, at your organization, and people are like, hey, fun fact, the world is shutting down. You've got an hour to take your stuff and take your whole world that happens here and put it at home, okay? So what they really told you was everything that you know to be stable and familiar about this culture is being removed from you. And we are asking you as an individual to recreate this culture in your home. And so there are multiple ways that people reacted to that. So there's some people that acted to that level of stress as assimilated faculty. And they said, oh yes, this is my Super Bowl. I have been waiting for 5 years to show my boss how wonderful remote work can be. I will mentor my colleagues. I am going to get more Zooms. I am going to spend my own money to get apps to help everyone. This is wonderful. And the reason that they could do that was because they were familiar enough with the online space and the culture that was associated with it to make that happen. Then you had what's called integrated faculty. And those faculty members took a deep breath and said, this is crazy, and I really want to be back in my classroom, but I'll do what I need to do to get through this semester because I know enough about online culture. I'm still going to have to learn a lot, but I'm just going to I'm going to go with the flow as much as I can. It's not my Super Bowl, but I'm kind of indifferent about it, right? I don't feel one way or the other. Then we had faculty, and you know these faculty, because these are the faculty who are like, hey, the world is shutting down. And they were like, I heard you. So I posted my final online and I graded them and submitted my final grades because it was too overwhelming to consider how I would get from point A to point B. Because my brain has to process not only is the world shutting down, but that I have to move this very separate life that I have kept for a very long time, this linear life. And now you're asking me to bring that culture into my home. That person responded in that way. And then we had faculty members and coworkers who unequivocally froze. They weren't doing it to be disrespectful. They weren't doing it because they weren't good employees. They were doing it because the prospect of the removal of what they knew to be familiar and the request of recreating that familiarity in their home space or in an online space is way too overwhelming. And so it tapped into the nervous system and said, listen, I'm going to fight, flight, or freeze. And they froze. And they said, I cannot take in what's happening right now. I just need a minute. And this is where we got a lot of a huge pocket of people retiring, because it was just too much and they couldn't do it. It wasn't that they didn't want to. It wasn't that over time they couldn't have gotten with the program. It was that the psychological stress of that change was too much. And so this is the difference. It is a response to the stress. And so that's why we have to ask ourselves in our classrooms, if we're teaching, what are we teaching? How are we teaching it? Because am I creating a space that people can move from marginalization to more integration? And this isn't, again, saying, oh, we have students of color and you're going to totally do it like this, right? That's not what we're saying. The assimilation here is saying, I'm familiar enough with the culture and I can kind of move through these spaces. And so the big question that I get from a lot of people is, well, what about the students who, have marginalization, but they'll learn in spite of the marginalization? They will, except for the fact of the brain can only really do two things or one thing at once. It can learn or it can lifeguard, but it can't do both. So sometimes we have students who put on that full lifeguarding piece and they can pass your test, but they're not actually learning. They're just passing your tests, right? And then we have the reverse of students who can't lifeguard at all and can barely function in a classroom, but they're still learning. That's their triage. They are learning the information, but they can't get it back out to you. They can't do it in the way that you're asking. And so that's why it's important to understand those differences. And so when we take a theoretical approach and we say, okay, there's lots of, something like the community of inquiry theory, which is very common in online spaces, right? You've got cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. But the problem is, and even Garrison, Archer, and Anderson said it themselves. They said, listen, in the beginning, they said only cognitive presence is important. That's a very Eurocentric way to do things. And they came back 10 years later and said, you know what? We talked to a couple more people. We looked at it a different way. It's actually all important, right? But from a white male Eurocentric perspective, it was the critical thinking that was important, not because they were racist. It's nothing like that. It's just because culturally that's what's valued. So usually what's valued is what drives practice. So if we ask ourselves now, what are those best practices? How do we teach through the marginalization? There's a couple of ways we can look at this stuff, right? So when you think about culture, you can think of one of these three ways. Let's see, time work, all right. We're cultural, so you think of the cultural lens approach, and this is something that was created by Hardin, and Hardin says, listen, every part of thinking and education is influenced by culture. It's just a matter of what degree, right? So that's one way to look at culture. A second way to look at culture is something that I worked on with my team over at the center, which is looking at, if we took something like cultural presence, or if we took something like cognitive presence, what's missing? Well, these are all of those pieces that are missing that would engage people in culture. Number one, people have to want to be culturally responsive. Number two, they have to look at the relational aspects of their course rather than the transactional. Number three, they have to give consideration to collaborative and contextual learning. And I'm going to give you examples of all these things. We're going to do models of these things that you can take to your class with you when you do it. A lot of the literature says independent student learning is what's valued. Strong online learners are independent, but in truth, strong online learners are very interdependent. They're interdependent on the faculty, the syllabus, they're interdependent on curriculum, they're interdependent on peers when they're not there. So we keep saying this independence, but when we really look at what successful students are doing, they're not doing it in a vacuum. They're using YouTube, they're using any resource that they can find to support their learning. And then there's, again, this thing of divergent versus convergent thinking. And we have really focused on critical thinking, which is important. But we also have to tap into divergent thinking, which I'll give you an example of again in a little bit. The other thing is you can look at culture like Bloom's, right? So if you look at Bloom's is something very familiar to a lot of people. Bloom's was first kind of really solidified on the scene in 1956. We have to ask yourself, who was in college in 1956, right? So yeah, that works, making a lot of assumptions, making the assumptions that I feel comfortable in the learning environment, everyone looks like me, my teacher looks like me, we all have a standard of expectation about how we're going to act and move in this space. But when you look at cultural considerations, this would all have to happen before you'd even get to Bloom's, right? So if you're thinking about Bloom's and you lay this on top, this is what it would look like. You have to have some form of self-identity that's affirmed in the environment. You have to have some avenue to a sense of community, right? Where in 1956, that sense of community was built in, right? Your worst case scenario was you weren't wealthy and everyone around you was wealthy, but they all looked like you. You all had some sort of common experiences, just like at a predominantly Black college right now. If you were to walk into Spelman and you're white and you don't have a lot of access to Black culture, you would need someone to help you build a sense of community in that space, because it would be very off-putting to you. And then you'd have to ask yourself, now I have to cultivate this culture. So what does that look like? And that really is talking about bonded communal experiences. What experiences can you create for your learners that are communal or that they can share? What opportunities are you providing for interdependence? And I want to make this really clear. People confuse dependence with interdependence. Interdependence is saying most of the time I'm capable of doing things on my own, but if I need help, there is someone there and vice versa. Interdependence is saying I'm creating an assignment as an individual assignment, but one piece of that individual assignment requires collaborative work, right? So after we get through that, then we have to kind of reflect on the learning environment and say, what's really valued in these experiences? Whose experiences are we uplifting? How many diverse examples do I have? And diversity, I think people get stuck again on race and ethnicity. Diversity is diversity. Diversity is any thought that comes to the table. Diversity is anything that makes whatever is being said thought about differently. And so we have to kind of think about that. And for me, just full disclosure, I'm biracial. So I can flow in those two spaces very easily without a problem. What's fascinating to me is I have relatives on both sides that have a very difficult time flowing in both of those spaces, right? For a variety of reasons. And so when you think about divergent thinking, you have to just recognize that everything that I'm presenting, even though this is what the curriculum requires, may not be the full learning experience for my students. And this is where people get really hung up, especially my science people. So if you're a STEM person, hang in there with me, because let's say you're a nursing instructor or something like that, and you have state boards that you have to do, and you can't change the curriculum, then don't change the curriculum, but then you have to change your delivery. Okay, you can't change the curriculum, but you have to change the delivery. Then we've got exploring. How many opportunities do students have to explore your content beyond what you're providing, right? And the big thing at the top is the application. The application should mean something to each individual student, right? So you can put up literally these prompts, right? You can say something like, your ticket out the door, if you use ticket out the door, is, I want to pay closer attention to fill in the blank. I can see where fill in the blank. I believe that fill in the blank, and so on, right? So those are those things that help us kind of think about culture, and we kind of lay that on top of our frameworks that we have now. We don't have to throw out the kitchen sink, but we have to clean it. You know what I mean? And so let's talk a little bit more now about, but let's just do an example real quick. So if everybody could just go to the chat and just pretend we're in an online class and just introduce yourself and just put a fun fact. And you can just do your first name. Hi, my name's so-and-so, fun fact about me, right? Because that's what most people do if they're in an online class. Right, so just go ahead and post in the chat there. Yeah, so we got some people, let's see. Perfect. Hi, Julie. Yep. I grew up in a no TV home. My mom tried that, Julie. Then my uncles came to visit and then we got a TV. Yeah, hi, my name's Time. I wiped out one. Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, hi, my name's fun fact about selling. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yeah, right? So I got some information. People love dogs. People grew up in a no TV household, right? And so that's a very convergent thinking kind of thing. I asked you to do a task. You said it back to me. Now watch this. Here's a different type of discussion. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to stick you in groups. I think I have that ability. Do I have that ability? I don't know. I don't see
Yeah,
it on my.
I can put them in the breakout
Okay,
rooms.
yeah. Put everybody in the breakout rooms. You can start setting those up or however you do it. So here's the question that I want you to talk about with your peers in the breakout room, which is the following. If you could talk to your ancestor from 150 years ago, or someone who looks like you from 150 years ago, what would you tell them about your personal educational experience or your subject matter that you have taught, right? If you're not teaching, you can say your job, okay? So what is that, if you could go back in time 150 years ago and you could meet an ancestor of yours or just someone who looks like you, what would you tell them about your education, your educational experiences or your subject matter? So go ahead and go in your group and we'll try that and then we'll come back. And Gary, I don't know if you need me to stay here just because I'm a host, so sometimes the host.
It's up to you. You can jump into a room if you want, or you can stay
Well,
here.
this is recorded, so if you're gonna stay, if you want to
I
model
will
it with
stay.
me, I'll model it with you. Okay. So so answer, riddle me this, right? If you could travel back in time 150 years ago, what's something you'd want someone to know about your subject matter, maybe the job you're doing now, or your educational experiences?
Yeah, my background is law, so I teach business law. So I probably would talk to them about how commerce has changed over the years and how the law applies to it today, and then ask them how that would be different from their time.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And it's so funny with this question because you're more like me. I'm more of like the surface person, where like some people go super existential and they're like, could I even communicate with my relatives? Like, I don't know, so it's like they kind of like work through it. Yeah. I don't know. I think I would want to tell my answers. It depends. Like I said, I'm biracial. So my mom's family immigrated here from Germany in the 40s. And so my grandma was put in a kindergarten class when she was 12 because she didn't speak English. And so that really kind of like skewed her understanding of education itself. And if she were still alive, which is, more than or less than 150 years ago, I think I would have jumped back to her mom and let her mom know how important education was, and that it shouldn't have been like, no matter what you experience, like you need to fight for your education. Like, don't give up just because of one experience.
Right.
And on my dad's side, I think I would say something more to the effect of like, it looks different, but the same in the future in some ways. Like, if some things look very, very different, some experiences are the same. But in the scope of time as a whole, right, the United States moves fairly quickly, right? So 150 years ago, right, you still have people owning slaves, and now we do, but it's called human trafficking and it's the computer. And it's not necessarily race, it's just like the sex trade or something like that. You know what I mean? But I'm like you, I'm also more inquisitive of like, I have so many questions, like how would, and I just on a total aside, I had the pleasure, and if you haven't gone, you need to go. It's down in Montgomery. I went to the Social Justice Museum, and it was wild because they have a map of the Commerce Block there, and it was just wild because it was all of like these sub commerces for slavery, and it was just wild. And it was like Lehman Brothers did the holdings. So like once people came in, they cleaned them and they did holdings and financing. And then you had this other group of people, and they did the insurance. And
Wow.
it's this whole commerce corridor. And I thought to myself, I'm like, but yeah, it's an industry, right? So every industry needs the sub industries to make it work. But it was amazing to see, like, you know, like Lehman Brothers, Saks, like those names that you knew. And it's like,
Mhm.
okay, like it was just wild. It was just wild to see it. So I think that's kind of what I would say.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
we're probably done in the breakout rooms. You want me to
Yeah,
bring everybody
That's
back?
fine. Yep. Bring everybody back. Yep.
They'll be closing in about a minute.
All
Some of the
right.
rooms had 2, some of them had 3. In some
Yeah.
cases, in some of the rooms, it looks like the other person didn't join them. So you might have some
Yeah.
folks who
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Yep. Yeah. So it's good. It's good. Yeah, and the whole purpose of this discussion is just to tap into divergent thinking, so you learn more about people than you would otherwise. Instead of like, hey, what's your name, where you're from, right?
Right.
So so that's always interesting.
Got about 20 seconds left.
Yep, that's a good sign though. If people are still talking, that's a good sign.
I don't think that we had a choice to come back. I didn't click anything. We just were bounced back. Of course,
Yeah,
I don't see
I
my
made-
group members here.
I made
There
you
they
come
are.
back.
They're coming.
There they go.
There they come. All right, back from the Zoomosphere. Okay, so one of the things about this discussion, right, is that for the people who want to have the discussion about race, ethnicity, or their background, they can have it. And if you don't want to have it, you don't have to have it, right? But you learn a lot more about the people around you with a prompt like this than the prompt that I gave you, right? Does that kind of make sense, right? Hey, my name's this, I have a dog. The key factor with these pictures is that you don't get these pictures yourself. That's a hard no. What you do is you ask your students for pictures that represent their families, because you do not want to be the person who's like, oh, I've put these pictures here and I've offended someone. So over time, at our organization, we've done a lot of culturally responsive training, and the only 2 requirements that we have is, if you're comfortable, if you wouldn't mind sharing a photo that represents your family, and we just ask that it be black and white, or you make it black and white just so it looks older. And so these are just some of the pictures that have been selected. So it's not me projecting what I believe culture is. It is people that we have worked with, and these are their perceptions of their culture, right? So that's a big one. So it's a great discussion prompt. You can add it anywhere, and it's very, very helpful. I'm going to skip over a couple of these things. We talked about what cultural responsiveness is. And the big piece about cultural responsiveness, it's not commandeering somebody's race or ethnicity. It's not saying that you totally get it. It's not saying that, you know, you're othering people and saying, well, I have one Latino student, so I'm going to teach them differently than I teach, you know, everybody else. What you're saying is I just recognize that no matter what I've been taught, it's only in one lens, and I can branch out to be more effective, to reach more of my students, and to create a more cohesive learning environment. Certain cultures, certain aspects of online culture are very influenced by ethnicity, and this is true of face-to-face teaching as well, or on-site teaching. Group norms, how your students work in groups is very dependent on their culture. Building trust, social identity and how it's affirmed, ethnic identity, academic outcomes, and academic feedback. And I'm going to show you examples of those as well. And when you take classroom culture and you break it down, this is what it looks like. These are the 5 areas in a classroom where, if you were trying to change the culture of your classroom, these are the 5 main areas. These are measurable areas, and these are outcome-based areas. So you have academic culture, and this is how your students interact with policies or just general announcements of what's going on in the online space. You've got cognitive culture, that's how students are thinking about information. You have collaborative culture. A lot of times people say, yes, peer learning, but they don't set the stage for peer learning. the community as a whole. Who are your students in that space? Who are they to you? Are they, who do they want to be? Right? Are they learners and it's a student-teacher relationship? Are they stakeholders in their learning where you want them to have more responsibility? Are they decision makers? Are they empowered to influence curriculum and what they're being taught? Is there an expectation of caregiving for one another? Those are all things that influence culture, specifically in online spaces. And then ethnic culture is kind of flows through all of those. And really it's intersectionality as well. So how do I know all this, and why should you even think about this? Well, it's because I can measure, as a psychologist, I can measure acculturative stress levels and then break it down on a tiered system. So if any of you have been in a K-12 setting, this kind of looks like an RTI model. It is, with the exception of data collection all the way through, right? So if I measure your acculturative stress, I can then look in the learning environment and tell an instructor exactly what to do to support that student. So in general, there are things we can do for all students that can be helpful. But let's say that that's not enough for a student. Well, then we'd have to look at tier 1 and tier 2. We'd have to look at how we're doing everything for everyone, and then how we're putting them in small groups, because that could be a very marginalizing process. And let's say those two things don't work. Well, then there are things that you can do for the individual student, right, to make that work. And so that's how I know that. And so it's not just a random thing, and that's the problem. Historically, what we've done is said to faculty, be culturally responsive. Nobody knows why. Like, even if you put it in the form of don't be racist. Well, if someone doesn't feel that they're racist, then that's not going to change anything, right? We can't control what other people think and do. So the bottom line is you have a student who's not learning. Why are they not learning? Right? And if we can rule out all those other factors, this is the one thing that we haven't really looked at. And so what this does is it creates an if-then scenario. So for instance, if you take the social justice theory that's out there right now, it says, well, everybody has to do everything this way because this is what this is social justice and this is what it looks like. You can do that with the exception of, if that stress is coming from outside the academic environment, that could be very offensive to a student of color in your class, because what they're going to say is, do you think I'm dumb? Do you think I don't understand what needs to be done academically? That acculturative stress is not in the academic environment. It's in the social environment or the greater environment at large. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not experiencing things in the institution, but this is why some students are very, very offended when we say, hey, there's a multicultural club that can support you, or hey, like, I understand, like, I'm working on my own like social justice stuff, and I understand that you're a student of color and this and this and this. However, if it's inside the academic environment, that would be relevant, right? So I'm going to skip a couple of this stuff because some of this just isn't relevant to you. And I'm going to just start to show you how we're actually going to do these things. So we can break that down on a tier, and that's what I just showed you. So for people who have a minimum level of acculturative stress, you can do something like the lecture launch we just did, right? So we're good there. Now, again, you can also do something, it's called a sense of community rubric. And I can post that on the Padlet so you guys can retrieve it from there. This is something you would do once every other week, or once a month if you're working in a 12 or 16 week course. And what you're doing is you're saying, I'm not just looking at your academics, I'm looking at the quality of the climate that we're in. And so you can take the rubric and post it. I'm so sorry. You can take the rubric and post it and show your students, hey, this is how I am sensing how the community is going. And then you can digitize it, and then they can put their 2 cents in. So maybe you feel like, hey, everyone's working really great this week, this and this and this, but maybe the students are like, no, I feel like we're totally separated because of what happened over the weekend in Flint, Michigan, right? So it kind of helps you kind of support your students. And again, when you look at the research, a lot of it is in that Eurocentric lens of the self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-motivation, where a lot of collective groups need more than that. They need to know how the community is doing as a whole. Is it just them who's feeling isolated? How many other students are feeling that way? Well, I'm glad that, on the rubric, the, you know, team cohesion was low because I was feeling that, right? So it can support all of those feelings that students are having. All right. Now, this works. I know it works. I checked it before. I checked all of them before, so hopefully this will work. So you can go ahead and you can use your cue there, and I will post the link in the chat for those of you using the computer. Oops, no, that's not really. The question here is when you're putting your students in groups, what are you really thinking about, right? So a lot of times what people do is the Eurocentric way of putting students in groups, and they just put them in groups. They randomly select students, which is a fine thing to do. It works, with the exception of so many things are influenced by culture, right? So it's time, it's how people feel comfortable in a group, and those type of things. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask you a question. I posted the link. Can everybody get that link or use their QR code? Okay, so that's what I'm going to ask you. What is most important to you when working in a group? You don't have to answer and why, but go ahead and share which one of those is most important to you. Is it most important that people understand your specific realities? Is it most important that you have time for complex storytelling and understanding from your peers? Is it that you want, if someone in the group isn't pulling their weight, you want leadership to know about that? Is it communal resources that you're all sharing and that people aren't kind of hoarding information? Is it extended time for social greetings, meaning you want to come into that group and yes, I'm so happy to be here and I want to see everyone and shake hands or fist bump or air bump, you know? Or is it harmony? Which one of those is most important to you? Okay, so we can go ahead and we have, I'm so sorry, my phone never rings this much. We have about, okay. Let me do that. All right, so we've got 6 people. We've got, let's see, all right, and I'll post this for you as well so you can see it. I just don't want to move off my screen since I had issues earlier. So we have 6 people who say respect for specific realities. We've got 2 people who say complex storytelling. We have 2 people who say communal resources. And we have 2 other people that say harmony. So respect for specific realities is really the winner there, okay? So now what you didn't know when I asked you to do that is what I did to model this for you is I said to myself, I realized that I'm missing an opportunity for my students to really kind of feel more comfortable in groups and work more effectively in groups. Now, what you didn't know, because you haven't taken this training, is that those are aligned through the research with particular cultural groups. So for instance, we have 6 people who said respect for specific realities, but culturally, that is an African-American cultural imperative, which is why in 2020 or 2021, if no matter how you felt about it, if you minimized the experience of George Floyd in any way, or anyone before him or since, you are going to really have a visceral repercussion because it is offensive to the sensibilities in African-American culture to think that you are devaluing what is a reality in my world, that you are taking down the importance of this specific incident, this specific story, because as someone who's half African-American, there are so many power in millions of stories that we've never heard. So when we're seeing it and you're looking at it and people try to minimize that culturally, right? Culturally, that is something that the culture does not tolerate, not individuals, not people who are Black from Europe. I'm talking about African-American culture specifically. So some of you said, hey, complex storytelling. Well, in Cambodian culture, that is what is most important to a group. So when we throw people randomly together, we miss an opportunity to have them come together and think about themselves in different ways. Now, that doesn't mean that we take everyone who says respect for specific realities and put them together, because the optics of that in a classroom could look like there are 3 Black students and they are all together. And that's, unless that's what they ask or want, that could look very different, right? So the whole point is that your classroom can be diverse or not diverse at all. And I've been in a classroom where I've been the only person of color. I would have liked to have the opportunity to have that discussion. But if it's not even something that's presented, then that can go way left. I randomly picked these. There was no rhyme or reason why I picked them. But this allows people to cognitively position themselves differently in online group spaces or face-to-face group spaces. But what we do is we miss the opportunity and we say, okay, just like we did, right? I said, Gary, put everybody in groups, right? Now, if I was setting you up beforehand and I was actually teaching you, then we would have had way more discussion about what it means to you to be in a collaborative experience, right? Because there's lots of pieces to that. And this is what's called a tier 3 consideration. And so we're moving from the small group now to the individual. Academic culture, again, is very Eurocentric. There's nothing wrong with that. My mom's from Europe. It's just that it doesn't leave room for anyone else. And that's the problem. And when we look at the context, when we look at what we're doing, there's not enough room for other people. So for instance, if you look at all the best practices of course design, it falls within the culture of English framework, right? So you say, okay, we have clear objectives, and I'm gonna be the sage on stage, and I'm gonna go around and I'm gonna facilitate this learning out of you, and then I'm gonna critique that. In collectivist cultures, it doesn't work that way. There's a lot more interwoven competency, and we don't see that in higher ed, and we also don't see that in K-12, meaning that what I learned in my science class, I'm expected to use as well in these other classes that have nothing to do with science, right? There's no expectation of interwoven competency. So the only place we really see that is in student development specifically. But a lot of people forget that that's part of our job, right? As faculty, we are developing students. So the question is this is fine, but where's the rest of it? And this is just a juxtaposed position. That's why I use this. And I use this picture because it's just such a stark difference, right? Now, if you know anything about Tom Torlino, if you were a STEM instructor, you would know that he's the government liaison to the Navajo Nation when they were looking at the water crisis in the early 40s. So that would be something as a Native American I would want someone to share with me, even if I'm not Navajo and that's not the nation that I come from. At least you showed some sort of something for that complexity. And the complexity of the storytelling is that it's not just a white story. It's not just a Eurocentric story. There are a million other stories, but you have to learn the stories to be able to share them, right? So that's the cultural competency piece. Again, you see the same thing here. English culture says clear assignment objectives, consultative facilitation. But if you were to take the African American cultural framework and apply that to the same methods of teaching, you don't start from a deficit mindset. You don't say, okay, here you're coming in, how many people have taken chemistry before? How many people have taken a psychology class before? Because what you're doing is setting that up for a deficit mindset. Because I'm looking around, whether I'm white, Black, or indifferent, and I'm like, hey, a lot of these people have taken a psychology class and I'm one of the 7 people who's not raising their hand. Instead, you want to start from a strength-based approach to learning and teaching and saying, listen, everybody has strengths, let's find some of them. And give students opportunities to dig deep themselves to show you the strengths that they have and build learning opportunities based on that, right? And again, that's the example I gave earlier of the critical thinking. Again, Garrison, Archer, and Anderson, 3 Canadian white men, they said, this is the way it is. It's critical thinking. This is everything. And they came back 10 years later and had to say, no, the social aspects are just as important. Well, anyone who's social could have told you that. Anyone who comes from a collective culture could have told you that. Anyone who likes collaborative learning could have told you that. But because you drove the literature, that's what was presented. And so we just have to be honest about that, you know? And here's the last example of a tier 3, and this comes down to an individual student. if you look at how you've been giving academic feedback or how you've taught to give academic feedback, it falls in a very Eurocentric lens. And so again, it's that it's the consultative facilitation. It's the self-reflection. I want you to reflect on all the wisdom I've imparted on you. The Dutch culture, it says, you know, there's a right answer and I want that right answer. The German culture, everybody's familiar with because it's the sandwich method. It's the balance of empathy and leadership. I'm going to say something nice, I'm going to critique you a little, and I'm going to say something nice, right? And these are all cultures that we've adopted. These are parts of cultures that we've adopted in academia. These are not, you know, these are not saying, you know, because I've had people say, I'm African American, I didn't know I was German, right? That's not what it's saying. It's saying the academic culture at large, this is what's kind of been driven. And the Irish is the importance of the individual contribution. So you get people saying things like, oh, thank you so much for submitting your assignment this week. Here's my feedback, you know, tell me any questions or whatever. Well, if we were to, and again, I just use African American because in our culture, in the American culture, they're very juxtaposed. And so that's why I use those two examples, but there's a ton of other examples that I could show you. So if you were talking about giving academic feedback with an African American lens of academia and what would be of value, it would be a strength-based perspective. It would be using narratives, and it would be showing in the work examples of collectivism for growth, right? It would be individual things that they could do and also collective things that you have set up to be done. And I don't have time to go into all that right now. I wrote a book on it. It'll be out soon, so you can look at it there. Communications and highlighting, again, of both those specific realities, historic and present. And so, and in the book, I go through and I pull examples of academic feedback that's being shown in universities, and I break it down by each line and show you what's what. And those comments, all people say, oh yeah, I've said that, I've done that, I did this, oh, I didn't think about that. And that's the point, right? Is that we're just trying to get a more robust cultural application to how we're doing what we're doing. So these are just the final thoughts, right? The current models have left people guessing. We absolutely can measure this so we know what's most effective for individual students all the way up to organizations. Students and faculty deserve to know and have a more structured idea of what this is, instead of keep doing the same thing, because we are leaving faculty behind, we are leaving students behind, because no one can say what it is, right? So it's kind of this all or nothing and this blanket like, oh, just do this. Where in my world as a psychologist, I can measure it and I can show you unequivocally that this intervention, you doing this cultural, what you believe to be cultural competency or cultural responsiveness, will fundamentally delete a barrier to learning, and that's the difference. You know, just to start, you know, start small and think big. Identify a place where you might want to apply some of these things, whether it's a whole group or your small group or individuals. And just think culture and connection. So with that, I am 1 minute over. I'm going to stop there. Any thoughts, comments, questions?
Thank you, Courtney. We are out of time. We're about
There you
to go into other meetings, so.
go. Go for it. Sorry, I was right on time, I think, right?
Yeah,
an hour,
you did good.
right?
You did good.
Okay.
You did good.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a
so-
little link there for you. So if you want to just type in a one-word takeaway sometime today, that's fine. I usually just give it
Awesome.
back to ETOM so they can have it for their information. So, oh, I'm so glad you liked it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, everybody. Thank you.
So
Take
can
care.
we get the PowerPoint?
Yes, I'll have to take out some of the slides because they're with the certification program that I have. They just let me use them. So you can have whatever else I can leave there.
Okay.